Dear friends, my name is Aryan. I am a postgraduate student of the International Open Yoga University. I teach yoga and meditation in St. Petersburg, Russia, in my yoga classes and lead meditation department of the Open Yoga University. You are welcome to our website www.yogaopenyoga.com. If you want to study the theory and practice of yoga and meditation online, you can enroll in the free course there. If you plan to become a yoga instructor in the future, you can enroll in our yoga teacher training course. Dear friends, this is a series of lectures on the history of meditation. The history of meditation is closely related to the spiritual culture of humanity, because meditation is the main method for cognizing the spirit, the higher self, and the supreme self or absolute. The earliest references to meditation practices were found in the Shruti texts. Shruti means heard from the Supreme in Sanskrit. Shruti were passed down over the centuries. Then they were recorded and preserved to these days. Shruti transmitted the knowledge of how to get to know both your spirit and the Supreme Spirit. This knowledge has considered the highest knowledge, and it was carefully guarded and preserved. The ancient Aryan society was the place where the highest knowledge and practices were preserved and transmitted. This is a lecture on how that society was organized and how the Aryan preserved and transmitted this knowledge. Then we will also briefly discuss the structure of the Vedas. The Vedas are the most ancient texts of mankind, which explain the structure of the cosmos and the laws of the universe. They talk about the essence of a man, his path on the way to achieving liberation from suffering and merging with the Supreme Spirit. I will also talk about the important Vedic terms and concepts. And now, let's talk about the Aryans and their tradition of passing the highest knowledge. When we begin to study any culture or tradition, we, first of all, rely to textual sources and monuments that we know of. When it comes to the Aryans, things are not as clear. There is not a single text of that time that was survived until nowadays. The tradition was being passed down through generation verbally until it was written down around the 1000 BC. Those texts are not small. The most ancient texts in Russian translation occupy 3 thick volumes. They were transmitted verbally for several millennia, possibly even earlier than 2 to 3000 BC. And imagine, these texts have not changed over the millennia. It's amazing. It's a sure fact that these texts were written by different people in different parts of India. When they were compared, it turned out that they are all the same down the smallest detail and have a rigid, unchangeable shape. It seems that the preservation of these texts was the most important cultural goal of the Aryans. In India, the culture of preserving and using such texts survived until nowadays. Today, sacred texts are pronounced the same way they were pronounced thousands of years ago. However, there is no certainty that today we understand what they actually meant before. And now about the social organization of the Aryan society. The word Aryan means noble, glorious. The Aryans had a single language, Vedic Sanskrit. In 5000, 3000 BC, Aryans lived in the area from Carpathians to the Caucasus. In 4000 BC, the movement of their tribes began in all directions, and their ethnos spread to many territories. The culture of the Aryans significantly influenced the culture of those peoples with whom the Aryans came into contact. Ultimately, the Aryans settled in India. So their knowledge, cultural traditions, and written sources were preserved in India. The Aryans had a specific organization of their society. The society was divided into varnas, groups within the society. Varna means color, but it's not the color of the skin, but the color of the clothes of each varna. The social organization of the Aryans was called the tribe system. Tribe means 3 groups or varnas. These groups lived together and had one language. They all formed a social community, but their origin were different. They could mix with each other, but in very limited forms. They had certain marriage laws, which they still have today. By the way, those laws ensured the preservation of genius groups within the tribe. Varnas were a sacred relationship with each other. Varna of the Brahmanas was considered the highest. Brahma is divine power. A Brahman is a priest. After the Brahmanas was the Varna of the Kshatriyas. Kshatra is power, strength. They were the warriors. Raj was the leader of the Kshatriyas. He was the actual ruler or a king. However, his status was lower than the status of the Brahman. The third Varna was the Vaishyas. Vaishya is the cow. They were cattle breeders and farmers. They were also engaged in other crafts, producing various goods for society. All Varnas were free. No one was a slave to anyone, but everyone fulfilled their role in society. The Aryans conquered large territories. There were tribes of people of non-Aryan origin, Dasyas, that lived next to the Aryans. They had a different language. One of the Veda hymns says, "Distinguish who is Aryan and who is Dasyi. Punish the one who has no vows. Give them over the power of those who spread the sacrificial straw." That is, the Aryans performed certain sacred acts, rituals, to maintain divine order and law. Anyone who didn't perform the rituals should have been in the power of the Aryans. The conquered people were included in the system of the Aryan society in the form of the fourth Varna. It was Sudras. Sudras were servants. There was a wall between the three Varnas and the Sudras. The Aryans were not allowed to marry the Sudras, and the Sudras were not allowed to produce anything for Aryans. That is, the Sudras could not eat the bread of the Aryans. But on the other hand, they were allowed much more than the higher Varnas. Secondary marriage of widows was allowed. There were no food restrictions, and so on. The higher Varnas had many prohibitions. The higher Varna was, the more restrictions, duties, and responsibilities it had towards the society and God. The most important difference between the Sudras and the other Varnas was that the Sudras did not take vows of keeping sacred knowledge, and accordingly, this knowledge was not communicated to them. Taking vows and keeping sacred knowledge was a special ceremony, an initiation for a child. It was performed on a child, a boy at a certain age. It would have been a girl. However, an initiation of a girl could take place only before the Aryans' resettlement to India. According to scientists, that was the time when women were equal to men in the society. They were as free as men. The rite and initiation was considered the second birth and was called Dvija, D-V-I-J-A. Dvi is two, Ja associated with birth. So Dvija is twice born. After this rite, the child was dressed with a sacred cord from the left shoulder to the armpit. From there on, the child was considered twice born. Those who were not born twice had no right to study sacred texts. There was also a group of untouchable in Aryan society. It was called Adivasya. They were outside the Varna system in general. They didn't follow Varna's rules and regulations. Those people were either born from wrong marriages or broke some laws. And those people didn't have any prohibitions. They had completely freedom. But they were forbidden to communicate with the Aryan Varnas to avoid defiling them. Varna system is still relevant in India today. The Aryan community was democratic, and the basis of the government was the National Assembly called Samhita. And three highest Varnas gathered for a National Assembly. Their decisions were obligatory to follow. The Raja had to carry out those decisions, but those decisions never touched the religious sphere. It was determined exclusively by the sacred knowledge of the Vedas. The Vedas have always been considered sacred knowledge. This knowledge wasn't invented, but heard from God. Therefore, this knowledge is often called Shruti. Shruti is heard. Shruti was transmitted by sages and seers, rishis. They conveyed the words of God to people. Those words were called Veda. Veda is to know. Therefore, the texts where the highest knowledge of the Aryans is transmitted are called the Vedas. This knowledge is beyond our intellect and logic. It makes a person a part of the highest, of God. The duty of the Aryan society was to preserve and transmit this knowledge. This knowledge also helped to introduce to Dasi tribes who surrounded the Aryans to divine life. Those were people with animal instincts. They were considered inferior and not ready for an organized social life. The Indian society, all three Varnas, lived in ashrams. An ashram is the association of people of the same circle with certain life goals. The ashram system reflects the 4 stages of the life of the Aryans. Let me to tell about each ashram separately. There were 4 ashrams. The first ashrama is Brahmacharya. Who lived here? Young people who studied the laws of Brahma. All the twice born became disciples and lived in the Brahmacharya, in the Brahmacharya ashram. Their task was to study the Vedic Samhita and learn how to apply it. The period of studying could last for a different number of years, but the end of it had to be at the age of 21 for all the Varnas. Brahmanas began studying when they were 7, Kshatriyas when they were 12, Vaishyas when they were 16. It was believed that the teacher gives birth to a student and becomes his spiritual parent, just as he becomes a father to his own children. The disciples were to accept a certain rite from their teacher. The ceremony was called Diksha, new birth, transformation into an embryo. The disciples were to take 2 vows: obedience to the master and sexual abstinence. The Aryans believed that if energy was wasted on procreation, it was incompatible with further spiritual development. As soon as a person began to live sexually, he stopped accumulating knowledge. He still could transmit and teach it. However, he didn't grow spiritually anymore. If a disciple broke his vow at some stage of his period of studying, then he was expelled from the teacher and remained dropout or became despised. That is, he became outside of society, equated with untouchables. Very strict law, isn't it? So, Brahman learned the teaching of the Vedas for 14 years. He must have learned the 4 Vedas, Brahmanas, and understood the Aranyakas, philosophical explanations of the Vedas' essence. The disciples who had learned everything well helped the teacher in the sacred rites. They were highly respected in society. If a student didn't study well, then they would say contemptuously about him that he knows only one Veda. He was not respected in society. He was not invited to perform rituals. The Kshatriyas and Vaishyas also studied the Vedas, but they did it for other purposes. They would perform sacred rituals only for themselves and their families, but not for the whole community, like the Brahmanas. Therefore, the training of the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas was shorter. After the training, a young man returned home, got married, and became a householder. That was the second ashram, called Grihasti. Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas could also live there. And they built their houses and worked as it should have been in a Varna. Grihasti were the only ashrams that produced material wealth for the entire society. It was normal for Vaishya to die as a householder in Grihasti. But that was considered shameful for the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. It was more preferable for them to leave home at the age of 64-67 when the eldest grandson returned from school. They passed the fire of the sacred hearth to their sons and went to the forest abode, where they could perform practices, rituals, etc. That was considered the third ashram, called Vanaprastha. Vanaprastha was a settlement where husbands lived with their wives. They lived off what they could produce, but didn't produce anything for others. Their main task was to pray, perform rituals, and educate young people. They were the main teachers for the Brahmacharya ashram. For the Kshatriyas, Vanaprastha was the end point. However, it was not the one for the Brahmanas. There was a fourth ashram for them. A Brahmana living in Vanaprastha could take the vow of renunciation, sannyasa, and become a hermit. He could do this at any time, for example, after the death of his wife. When a Brahmana wanted to become a sannyasin, he had to take two vows. First, a vow of complete silence. He was forbidden to speak on ordinary topics and was allowed to say prayers only. And second, he couldn't stay in one place for more than 3 days. He wasn't supposed to produce anything with his own hands. Besides, he couldn't ask for anything either. Sannyasins moved from a village to a village with begging bowls. If people wanted, they could give them something. If no one gave anything, a sannyasin could die of hunger, since he couldn't ask for anything using gestures or words. The main point for a sannyasi was to completely surrender oneself to God. He didn't belong to himself anymore. He didn't seek anything for himself. He had neither property nor home. He lived on earth, but as if he was not on earth anymore. Such people see the life differently. They were welcomed guests for the ashrams of Grihastha and Vanaprastha. Sannyasis visited their disciples and traveled to holy places. They were always on the move. In India, the funeral rite is always the same: burning at the stake. But there are two exceptions: infants under 2 years old and sannyasis. They are buried. It's believed that they are clean and won't defile the earth with themselves. Such was the society of the Aryans. Its main task was to transmit and preserve the higher knowledge. For thousands of years, this knowledge was wary of entrusting even the written word. And so it was even when writing was widespread. The sacred texts were not recorded for a long time, but were only transmitted orally. It was believed that only in the living heart of man is the word alive. If you write it down, it becomes dead. In fact, the Aryan society was a huge computer in which information was passed by people from generation to generation for centuries. Everything was structured. The youth memorized. The Grihasthas implemented the supreme law in life and fed the rest of the population at the same time. The Vanaprasthas taught, and the sannyasis were already outside the computer, outside of society. I told you about the structure of the Aryan society. This society had a special organization. This organization was aimed at preserving and transmitting higher knowledge. Knowledge is the most valuable thing in the world. Therefore, the goal of the Aryan society was high and practical at the same time. At this point, I would like to finish the first lecture on the history of meditation. Continue listening on the next Open Yoga Festival. In the next lecture, I will talk about the texts that preserved the knowledge of the Aryans, about the Vedas, as well as about the main terms and concepts of Vedic knowledge. I'd like to welcome to our website once more, www.yogaopenyoga.com. Study the theory and practice of yoga and meditation online. Everybody can find there something interesting and useful. I wish you all success in your yoga practice. Om Gam Ganapataya Namaha. And see you soon.